it's time to learn about perspective. I will try to keep the lecture part of this chapter a bit short and jump into more practical exercises as soon as possible. I don't want you to leave this chapter feeling overwhelmed or too bored. I remember when I first started practicing perspective, I personally had quite a hard time learning about it without getting tired, since it was all just boxes and straight lines. So, although I will be talking about boxes and lines here as well, I want to share an approach that helped me quickly get used to thinking in perspective and using it a bit more easily in my own work. And also a couple of known tricks that just make things a little bit more easy. Perspective is actually a lot simpler than many of us think. Maybe because it reminds some of us of math, it can feel a little bit dry to get through. But it's just another tool like anything else that you can use to make your illustrations more convincing. I'm not a master of perspective, but I think I have enough of an understanding to make it believable in my drawings, which is what I personally think is most important. So I won't be teaching you how to get perfect perspective, but rather I want to teach you how to get an intuition or feeling for what looks right. Perspective should serve you as a tool to draw more freely and not a shackle to make your drawings more stiff. So let's dive into it. I want to start by giving you an outline of the basic terminology related to perspective. First, we have the horizon line. Sometimes you'll hear the words eye level, and that's because the height of our eyes, or the height of the lens of the camera, these are the same thing, will always be level with the horizon line. I'll show you some examples of this in a little bit. And then we have vanishing points, which includes 1-point, 2-point, and 3-point perspective. Vanishing points are where parallel lines converge to. If they're not parallel, that means they have separate vanishing points. As you can see here, a cube has 3 sets of parallel lines, and I've indicated each set with different colors so you can see it more clearly. This is also partly the reason why we have 1, 2, and 3-point perspective. What type of perspective something is depends on how many sides of a cube you see, and also the angle of the camera. And then lastly, the effect we get when an object converges towards the horizon is called foreshortening. And then we have distortion. If your vanishing points are too close together, you'll end up with a sort of distorted look. If you see this example, you can see the cube takes on a sort of diamond shape. So generally speaking, you want to avoid that unless you're doing it intentionally. So it's usually recommended to spread the vanishing points a bit further apart for a more natural look. But you can of course use the distortion for a more dramatic effect. And I'll talk more about camera lenses and distortion in a little bit. So now that we've touched upon some of the basic stuff, let's dive a little bit deeper. So as I mentioned, the horizon line is always level with the height of the viewer's eyes or the height of the lens of the camera. And tilting the camera up or down doesn't move the horizon. I'll show you what I mean. So here we have this guy, and the horizon line is level with his eyes. And whether he's looking up or looking down, the horizon line stays the same. If he's looking down, he's just seeing more of the ground, and if he's looking up, he's seeing more of the sky. But if he steps up on this bench, the horizon line will follow too, because the height of the eyes has changed, and the horizon line is always eye level. This might sound very obvious, but it's good to know and be aware of. Another simple thing you can ask yourself when trying to figure out the horizon line is whether you're looking up or down at something. If you see the bottom planes of objects, it means it's above the horizon line and you are looking up at it. If you see the top planes of objects, it means it's below the horizon line and therefore you are looking down at it. Because of that, it's also important to consider quite early on what height you want your camera or eye level to be at. Let's say this guy's eye level is at 150 centimeters. With that knowledge, we'll be able to know how to scale everything else around him. If you, for example, want to add in more characters that are the same height, their eyes will always line up with the horizon line, no matter how far away or close they are to the camera. So just to show an example in context, if I wanted to scale this person down or up, first what I can do is put 2 converging lines from the top and bottom of the feet of the character, and then scale it based on that reference. Another, maybe more easy approach is to just be aware of the fact that the horizon line here is even with his knees. So as long as his knees are level with the horizon line, I can scale him up or down however I want. The eye level can be whatever height you want. It can be 1,000 meters or even half a meter. It's why we call it things like bird's eye view and frog's eye view. And just imagine how vastly different those two worlds look. And then there's vanishing points. Since I already touched on this a bit, I'll keep it pretty simple. 1-point perspective just means that we only have one set of parallel lines that are converging, and generally speaking, the camera is facing the subject pretty straight on. 2-point perspective means we have two sets of parallel lines that are converging in different directions. We usually get this while looking at something at an angle or when you see two planes of a cube. 3-point perspective is when there's three sets of converging lines, and usually occurs when you're looking up or down at something. Here you can see the lines converging quicker the more the camera moves above or below it. One thing I want to introduce you to right away, and also something that made perspective make a lot more sense to me, was the fact that you can actually have infinite amounts of vanishing points on the horizon line. But don't worry, this is a lot more simple than it sounds. Here we have a bunch of cubes, all parallel with each other. But what if we want to rotate one just slightly? Now it's rotated, but as you can see, it's no longer parallel with the other cubes, and instead we've created a new set of vanishing points. So what happens is that when you rotate a cube, the vanishing points move across the horizon, like this example. So any element in your picture can technically have its own vanishing points, but for the sake of keeping things simple, we don't usually do that. And luckily, we as humans like to keep things orderly, and buildings and rooms tend to be square. So the way I usually like to think of it is that there is a general direction that most things are converging towards. That will be your main vanishing point. And then you can add some rotated things here and there where needed. And if this doesn't make sense now, don't worry, I'll show you more examples when we do the exercises. And I think that will help you understand better too. And lastly, we've got focal length and distortion, and then we'll do the exercise after that. For cameras, there are different types of lenses that you can use, and some of them have a bigger field of view, which basically means that they are able to capture a bigger scene and are more zoomed out than a standard lens. And other lenses have a narrower field of view, so they're more zoomed in. These are called telephoto lenses. Here I've just used my iPhone camera to roughly show what it looks like. In this example, there isn't any obvious distortion, so I'll show you a few more examples and explain why. Here I have two images I took on my iPhone in a classic hand towards the camera pose. The left one is taken at half zoom and the right one with default zoom. As you can see here, the size of the hand has the same amount of distortion in both, and that's because they're at a similar distance from the camera. But because the right one is a lot more zoomed in, the figure takes up a lot more space in the frame. If we'd want the figure to take up a similar amount of space, we'd need to step back more, and then the distortion would be reduced. So distortion is all about how close something is to the lens. And because a wide-angle lens is more zoomed out and can capture a bigger scene, you naturally have to get closer to the subject if you want it to take up more space in the frame, which as a result will cause more distortion to happen. With that said, I think it's best we just start analyzing photos together, and I'll also show you the exercise for this chapter. Here you can see I've gathered a few different references, and I'll be using these to show you the exercise I want you to try. I'm not a master of this, so it's not a deep dive into perspective and all the different rules and techniques you can use to make it more perfect. The way I've learned perspective before is by drawing a bunch of boxes converging towards the vanishing points, but trying to plan scenes like this just from my imagination without any context of the real world didn't really work for me. So starting with boxes on a blank paper isn't my favorite approach, especially if you're already struggling to understand perspective. Another way I practiced was through observational studies, so either drawing from life or photo references, and trying to get the perspective to be as accurate as possible. I definitely prefer this method, but you sort of have to multitask a bit by keeping in mind accurate proportions and making everything converge right. So I want to make it one step easier by introducing you to an approach that helps you practice the basics of perspective and also learning how to see what's right. So what we're going to do is just draw straight on top of photo references. So there's no need to worry about proportions or making things look right. And instead, you can just focus on understanding how things converge, what type of perspective it is, and also practice relevant perspective techniques, but in the context of the photo. So you don't have to guess if it's correct. You can get that feedback right away. And what it will also show you is how many irregularities there are and that everything doesn't just follow one set of vanishing points. I've picked a variety of photos here, exteriors and interiors, different camera angles, and I recommend that you do the same. Find a good variety with different environments so that you can really get your eye used to all the different types of perspectives and what they look like. We're going to start by figuring out the general perspective first, and then we'll look for parallel lines to try and pinpoint the horizon and the vanishing points. So I'm just going to do that first, and I'll put down the opacity so that we can draw on top of it a bit more easily. We can see. Okay, so I'm just going to start with these top two first. Generally, to me, this looks like a one-point perspective because I'm mainly seeing lines receding this way. And there's not really, I mean, this one is kind of going like that, but that could also just be how the camera is sort of tilted. It looks like they're quite parallel too. So like this one is not going like this and this one's not going like that much. So to me, that looks like it's one-point perspective. So let's start by finding the horizon line. So I'm looking for parallel lines and seeing where they converge to. And where they meet should be approximately where the horizon line will be. So it seems like the horizon line is right around here. So I'm going to draw in a line. And that is my horizon line right there. So now we know that this is a one-point perspective. And then we can start building from there. Now, what I want to do next is just draw in some of the elements that I see here and see what I can learn from them. So I'll speed up the footage and get back to you in a little bit. What you'll see me doing here is just drawing in the big objects to sort of get a feeling for how I could plan a room if I were to draw it myself, and to understand the sort of proportions and size relationships. And I just want to clarify from what I said before. This one is mainly a one-point perspective, but there's probably a second vanishing point somewhere really far away. For this particular image, simplifying it to a one-point is more than good enough and convincing enough for a drawing. Okay, so now there's one thing that's maybe a little bit less simple than just drawing in rectangles. Here we have these pots, and they are cylindrical. So that means that we have to figure out how we draw a circle in perspective, which is called an ellipse. So you can, of course, try to just eyeball it, but it can be helpful to know how you can get a cylinder to look right in perspective. So I'm just going to show you a quick way that I do it when I want to measure it out a little bit. So this is what I usually do when I want to draw ellipses in perspective if I'm not eyeballing it. Here you can see a perfect circle, and it fits perfectly into this square. And no matter what angle you see the circle at, it's always going to fit into that square.